All right, so now that the Bondo has been applied, it's time to move on to the sanding phase. So I usually, as you can see here, I prefer to do as much of any project that I work on by hand as possible. You know, that means using hand tools like the sand block I have here over power tools or anything in general. Now, I mean, there are exceptions. There are just some things that I either don't have the proper hand tools to do, or time just becomes a factor. I mean, obviously there are other factors too. But in general, though, my preference is to be able to do things at hand. I'd rather take a little more time, so that way, the process is slower and I'm less inclined to, overdo it or have to, fix something because I went too far, too fast, like with a piece of power equipment or whatever. So the longer and longer I worked on this can, it was becoming more and more apparent that doing it by hand was not the way to go. I did a cursory, it was, doing this cursory sand around it, and just, some of those higher points where I put it on a little extra thick, like you saw me a little bit back there using the X-Acto knife to cut down one of the particularly big mounds, I mean, it's a very, very daunting, I don't know what the word I'd use, but it was daunting. So like you can see here, I'm kind of giving it a once over, not putting a whole lot of elbow grease into it, because, I knew it was kind of fruitless. I mean, like, you can't really tell here, but because of the time lapse, but even in the areas that I did try to sand really, really hard and get down flat just by hand, I was running into a lot of inconsistencies that was going to translate into a poor product once I wanted to get to the painting phase. So after giving the whole thing a good once over and effectively admitting defeat, I put it away and moved on to the topper, where my sander wouldn't have gotten in there anyway. So even though this was a pretty time-consuming process, it all had to be done by hand. And I figured that was just a better use of my time overall. So obviously I have changed gears and have started working on the lid of the topper. I did put the Bondo on really thick, in a pretty thick layer. I think you could see that in the previous section when I actually did the application of the Bondo. It was on there thick. I mean, you couldn't see any of the plastic through the Bondo at all. So I knew I was going to have my work cut out for me. So at this phase, I did end up putting in quite a bit of elbow grease, as you can see by the accumulating pile of dust at the bottom. So basically my strategy here was to just kind of go in hard on the first bit, get rid of all of the major lumps, and get to the point where I was starting to see some of the plastic through to as much of the surface as I possibly could. Because fortunately, since this is all going to be painted black anyway, I wasn't so concerned about it being perfectly level as I was about it having a good consistent layer, that once the black paint was applied to, wouldn't be it horribly obvious that it was level, which was the whole point of putting the Bondo in there anyway. I wanted a good I wanted a good consistent surface, not necessarily a, perfectly flat, perfectly level surface. So like you can see here, bits of the plastic are just starting to show through in that section that I've been working on this whole time here. And then, of course, as I was doing this, I realized that there were places that this, my little sanding block there just wasn't going to reach. So, keeping track of that too, while I was doing this was kind of thinking, like what kind of, tool am I going to need to bring? And, so I tried a little bit with the X-Acto knife and figured that in general, it would probably suit the purposes that I needed as long as I was careful with it. Because, like I said, the Bondo just went into places that there didn't even need to be Bondo, like up on the lip, and like I was just pointing out there, or down in the hole in the center where the bouquet goes. You can kind of see that deformation in the circle from where a good glob of Bondo got in there. And so, yeah, a big part of doing work like this is, it is really repetitive. It's not really exciting at all. It was probably right about now. I think this time lapse is 300%. So I'm you're seeing it 3 times faster than I actually did it. By now my arm was hurting pretty good. I was starting to get sore, just from the amount of oomph that I was having to put in to not take forever sanding down some of the particularly big globs. But you can see here, like pretty much all around, I've got the bare bones of where I was headed with the Bondo. You can see traces of the plastic coming through, most notably, like, because of that threading, where it's coming through here is really inconsistent. And unfortunately, there's no way for you to get a good view of or idea of the texture of it, but it was really, really rough, and I wanted it to be thinner. And so this point, you can really see that through the contrast of the plastic and the Bondo, exactly how rough the texture was on that lid. Because and like I said, that falls back to the trouble I was having with my filament feeding into the printer properly, and it's sitting on that support material. I'd never printed an item quite like this, so it was a lot of firsts. But yeah, but now that it's basically, it all has the rough sand, you can see exactly how bad it was in need of leveling. And then, here you can see all of that Bondo that was glomped into the corner of between the lip and the lid, that my sand block just couldn't get at. So, honestly, I was surprised at how well the X-Acto knife was working. Considering, you think Bondo becomes this really, really hard stuff, and in many ways it does, but at the same time, it's still, even in the dried form, very, very easy to work with. I will probably be using Bondo as needed in future projects. Because like I've said previously, I'm familiar with binary compounds, but not so much Bondo. This was my first experience with Bondo. I really like it. And your limitations are, because it's so thin, you would have a hard time making it a standalone material, but in terms of a support material, like things that you can use to remove seams between, two things that you've glued together that don't have a perfect seam, that you might not have a better alternative for, something that's going to be a little bit bigger than paint, will work really, really good. So I got a little bit sidetracked here, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm putting on the finishing touches with the X-Acto knife there, getting the Bondo out of the edges. And now that I'm done with that, I will move on to finishing the can itself. All right, sorry about the transition here, but I didn't have my sander ready to go, so I had to pull it out and get everything set up. I am using 100 grit sandpaper, so it was the closest I had to the approximately 80 grit of the blocks that I was using for sanding by hand. Actually, as it turns out, because you can put, you have motor assistance, and was able to put a lot of direct weight on the sander. The 100 grit actually did really, really well in terms of a balance between coming off quickly, but not coming off too quickly that I couldn't keep track of what I was doing. So I didn't over sand too much. So I got to sanding and noticing on that top divot pretty much right away. You can see me checking it as I progress along, that in my efforts to minimize my time spent sanding, I forgot about some simple science, and I can't remember what the term is called, but basically, because I was running the putty knife right over the top of those divots to fill in the divot, because the Bondo was softer than the two edges of the divot, when I was raking over it, it was actually making a minor depression, so it had this like little bow to it, that I kind of pointed out when I was doing the application before, because you could kind of see it on one of the sides, but it became really, really apparent to me here. And then the worst culprit being that top divot, but then even now working on the second divot, it was bits and places were starting to show signs of it on that one too. The third divot actually wasn't too bad overall for that, but as you can see here, I had to really put some muscle into it too, because there was so much Bondo at the bottom of the can that I was well, I was having a hard time getting off even with the palm sander. That said, I wasn't like, breaking a horrible sweat or anything like that, but it took a lot of work. This video, I think, is also 300% time lapse. So just doing this with the palm sander, because like I said, I didn't want to go too fast, was probably, I'd say, 20 minutes. Maybe a little bit less, but right around 20 minutes. So anyway, now that all the technical stuff's out of the way, I'll tell you actually what I'm doing. So now that I've gotten all of the really rough stuff, all the bigger bumps and stuff out, and I'm mostly working with a level playing field. You can see there's, some notches left in there, but all the big stuff is down. So with each pass at this point, I'm getting, using less and less weight and sanding off less and less actual Bondo, because I'm getting close to where I want to be. Like at this point, I'm mostly just making sure that everything is as level as I can get it, so that when I paint it up, it has a nice smooth appearance. Of course, I was also paying attention to make sure that there were, see whether or not there were any, like air pockets in the Bondo, which usually isn't a problem. I wasn't really noticing much of that, but what I was noticing was places where it needed more Bondo than I gave it, especially in areas not inside the divots, like the area right outside the divot, because when they put the divot in the can, the way that the can bends isn't just the inclusion of the divot. It the effect of it extends further out than that. So there's like basically a little dead space from each edge of the divot towards the flat of the can, and there were some places that I missed that, and the seam of the can, and other things that I was starting to notice too. So you can see I'm like getting really, really nitpicky. making sure that it's not too thick in some areas and thinner in others, because, you know, it can still be smooth, but be bowed out so that it has more of a cone effect than a tube effect, which is not what I wanted. Because, you know, they're called warp tubes, not warp cones. So, yeah, no, so as I was getting close, I was noticing, you know, there was stuff that I didn't do it quite right. So, not that I was horribly surprised about that, considering this is my first time with Bondo. Wasn't exactly sure how it was going to react. And, so, yep, I got to do a second application. You can see here how much Bondo ended up on me and on the floor. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. That little sander actually did a really good job, so it'll come in handy for sanding off the second application, which I will be adding here in the next phase. So anyway, yeah, you don't need to watch this whole thing, so I will see you back at the Bondo.